Namaskar, good afternoon and very good evening to our viewers who have joined us from India. A poet is a very sensitive and emotional person who has the ability to transform the feelings into words to bring it to fore to the world. It is not only for expressing the feelings of any individual, there are many evidences in the history that the pen has proved mightier than the sword with the capability to overturn the kingdoms. Today's topic under the India-Ireland Friendship Lecture Series is Poets as Citizen of Ware, Some Personal Reflections from Ireland Poetry and Power by Professor Ciaran Benson, who is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at University College Dublin, where he taught for over 30 years. His interests have spanned through social and cultural psychology, philosophical aesthetics, education, cultural policy, and art criticism, and he has published books in each of these areas. His books include The Absorbed Self, Pragmatism, Psychology and Aesthetic Experience, and The Cultural Psychology of Self, Place, Morality, and Art in Human Words. He was the founding chairman of the Irish Film Institute from 1980 to 84 and also of the City Arts Centre in Dublin and remained there from 1985 to 91. From 1993-98 he was the chairman of the Arts Council of Ireland. He has been active in contributing to the formation of Irish cultural policy since the late 1970s. He has chaired many arts organizations and policy working groups. Since 2013, he is the chairman of Poetry Ireland, the all-Ireland organization for the promotion of poetry in all its forms, and is also chairing a cross-governmental group on the future funding of public art in the Republic of Ireland. He is the member of International Association of Art Critics, and over the years he has curated a number of visual arts exhibitions in Ireland. Before I invite Professor Benson to present his lecture, I would request His Excellency the Ambassador of India, Shri Akhilesh Mishra, for his introductory remarks.
Namaskar, very warm welcome to each one of you to the Indian Embassy, and also my special greetings to all friends in Ireland and India who are connected with this program virtually. It is indeed a great privilege for me and my colleagues in the Embassy to welcome someone of such a great stature, a great intellectual prowess, multi-dimensional talent that Professor Benson has. It's a great privilege for me to have had the opportunity of interacting with him. As soon as I came to Ireland, I requested for a call and he was most generous to receive me. And since then we are in touch, and he has been so inspiring. Your deep commitment for the art and culture, and real brand ambassador of Ireland in the soft power field. I'm so impressed. Friends, just to give you the background of this initiative, India-Ireland Friendship Lecture Series, this year marks a very landmark year for both our countries. Ireland, 100 years of independence, and we are celebrating 75 years of India's independence. And looking back at the past 75 years of our history, I feel so grateful to Ireland, who inspired us during our freedom struggle, and also inspired us while we were drafting our constitution, and also in the field of art and culture and domain of ideas. Ireland has been a great source of inspiration. In poetry, particularly the friendship between Tagore and W.B. Yeats is very well known. Similarly, the women leaders from Ireland, they contribute tremendously in our awakening and the consciousness among women particularly. And Amy Benson, an Irish, was president of Indian National Congress. There had a long-standing connect between India and Ireland in the domain of ideas. And as ambassador of India at this particular juncture in history, this is my real ambition, that the relationship between our two countries has to be broadened. It can't remain confined between the two foreign offices or remain confined between Dublin and Delhi. It must have a whole of Ireland to whole of India engagement. While the trade, business, investment, and Indian diaspora, Indian students, that all is growing very rapidly. We have, they say, around 60, 70,000 strong Indian community in Ireland. 6,000 foreign and Indian students coming to Ireland for university education. India is the largest source of international students in Irish universities. That is growing, but I cannot overemphasize the Ireland's tremendous soft power in domain of creative industries, in domain of poetry, in terms of literature and multifaceted dimensions of intellectual thought leadership. I see there is an enormous benefit for multiple lines of communication. And that is why I think the support of esteemed friends like Professor Benson is tremendously valuable, because through initiatives like this, we are spreading the message of Ireland, the creativity and innovation of Ireland, thoughts of Ireland in a wider circle of intellectuals in India. Similarly, we are hoping that we have a similar series of stories coming from India through virtual lecture series for Irish friends. So this is our mission, and I'm so grateful for your presence, because it is great inspiration, support, encouragement to us, and profoundly grateful to Professor Benson for accepting our invitation. The domain of poetry is particularly very interesting to me, because my father is a professor of Indian philosophy, and I have some interest, and I'm struck that Vedas, which are considered the oldest composition in the world, so they have very beginning of the Vedas, there is a mantra which refers to Kavi. Kavi in Hindi means poet, and that is a divine attribute, because a poet is defined one whose vision transcends time, whose vision transcends location, and that exceptional gift of vision. And our sages have been very categorical, very blunt in telling us that the real vision is not gained through eyes, because eyes have inherent limitation. Yet chakshusha na pashyati yena chakshunshi pashyati. The real power is not the real thing is not what eyes see, but the real thing to contemplate is what gives eyes the power to see. The real power is not what brains contemplate on, but the thing which empowers the brain to think. And that is the spirit when they refer to poet. That poet can see what is not apparent to eyes. They can sense something which is not ordinarily seen by people. So that is why the importance of poet, importance of that vision, deeper vision, to see beneath and beyond the surface. And that is extremely important, because if you see only at the surface, if you see only what is seen to the naked eyes, then you see a lot of conflict, you see a lot of contradiction. There is no meeting, like in a tiny room like this, no two individuals are identical. But if you look, if you see beneath what is apparent to this superficial vision, then you see a new world. Then you realize a deeper interconnectedness, deep harmony, pervading the superficial contradictions and conflicts. And that is where the theme of Professor Benson's lecture is so topical, so relevant. Because inherently, a real poet is not bound by petty limitations, but relates to the much wider. In fact, in India, we talk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We see Vishwam Bhavat Eka Nidam. The whole world, whole cosmic existence as one single nest. So that is where the vision of a poet is so important, so relevant for India, Indian thought, and also for contemporary society, because we are suffering so much because of very narrow, very parochial, very self-centric, egocentric approach to reality, understanding. And that is why, Professor Benson, on behalf of Indian Embassy, I feel very deeply grateful for accepting our invitation and also choosing this fascinating topic. And I do hope that under your leadership, we have a more robust interaction between Poetry Ireland and Science Academy of India, and much more vibrant connection between, exchange between India and Ireland. Thank you so much. Very honored to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and to Hema for asking me here. The title follows from our meeting, the Ambassador and myself, and we found in the meeting we had that we had a lot in common. So this is what I want to talk on. And there are two Indians whom I greatly admire. So the epigraphs are Gandhi: "No culture can live if it attempts to be exclusive." And the second is Tagore, who had a huge connection to Ireland. "I will close my door to shut out all possible errors, but how am I to enter in right truth?" That's what I want to talk about. So, good evening, Indian friends. When Ambassador Mishra kindly invited me to reflect on, and I quote, 100 years of independence of Ireland, the role of poetry in national awakening and social transformation, my immediate response was to plead imposter syndrome. I am not an historian, nor am I a literary critic. And I suggested some alternatives to myself for this lecture. But the ambassador is quietly very persuasive, and here I am today. But where am I coming from? My background is in social and cultural psychology. It's in philosophy, and especially in psychological aesthetics. And I've had a long-standing involvement with cultural and education policy in Ireland. Underpinning this diversity of interest has been an abiding belief in the power of ideas to shape individual and societal lives for the better. And so I've chaired many arts organisations and projects over the last 40 years and more in Ireland, with many wonderful colleagues. For quite some time now, it's been my honour to chair the All-Ireland Organisation for Poetry in Ireland. And it was in this context that Ambassador Mishra and I recognised something that we share in common: a love of poetry and a belief in its pervasive, if subtle, influences. Ambassador Mishra concludes his perceptive recent essay, Echoes of Vedic Philosophy in the Poetry of Michael D. Higgins, by noting the imperative of inculcating a spirit of harmony, cooperation, and friendship, as in the Indian Vedic tradition. I quote from Ambassador Mishra: "Similarly, Michael D. highlights the importance of the spirit behind speech. Words matter. Words can hurt. Words can heal. Words can empower. Words can divide. Therefore, he, Michael D., earnestly calls for honest, dignified, respectful, and non-judgmental conversations in society." And later on, let's have conversations instead of advice. Now, this talk is offered in that spirit, but there is one last qualification that I might have in order to say something of relevance about Ireland and the role of poetry in Irish life over the last 100 years. And that is that I have lived in Ireland for nearly 3/4 of that century, and for better or worse, have felt the ripples of poetic influence in my own life and memory. It's been my privilege to have known many of the poets to whom I refer in this talk, and I call on them knowing of their personal commitment, both as citizens and as poets, to make this world a better, more democratic, kinder place for all the creatures that live on this fragile planet. So what follows then are some purely personal reflections on poetry and power from the perspective of this one Irish citizen. The population of the Republic of Ireland, from where I'm speaking, is 5.1 million. And Northern Ireland, which remains part of the United Kingdom, is currently 1.191 million, making an all-island total of just over 7 million people. The current population of India is 1.417 thousand million, making the population of the island of Ireland a tiny fraction of 1% of India. And you can see Ireland superimposed on India to see how small it is. Perhaps the best way of thinking of how Ireland's experience of the last century might connect to that of India would be to use the metaphor of a laboratory. Ireland as a laboratory for certain of the concerns animating Indian cultural and political life. Ireland is, as our second last president, Mary Akhilesh, succinctly put it, a first world country with a third world memory. Her references to Ireland's long history as a reluctant colony. A favourite saying in the Irish language of our current president, Michael D. Higgins, is Sco Akhilesh Awarmid. We live in each other's shadow. The shadow cast by a nation is not necessarily proportional to its size. Arguably, a nation that values highly words that are beautifully rendered or musical phrases distinctively its own might cast a disproportionately long shadow, and perhaps Ireland is one such nation. So let's see where this might take us. In his excellent collection of Irish poems over the centuries since 1916, the Irish anthologist Niall MacMonagle writes, and I quote, "In an apology for poetry, first published in 1595, the English poet and soldier Sir Philip Sidney claimed that, quotes, in our neighbour country, Ireland, where true learning goes very bare, yet are their poets held in devout reverence," end of quote from Sidney. And MacMonagle goes on to say, whether or not Sidney's first observation was or remains accurate, Ireland still respects and values its poets. They remake the language, they tell the truth as they see it, they challenge us and open us up to the world, they rearrange how we view it. So in what follows, let me simply weave fragments of history and poetry together, coupled with some personal reflections on the power of poetry and poetry's relationship to power, but also from Ireland over the last century. My method will be one of simple juxtaposition, a fact from Irish history followed by a poem, or a line or two from a poem. That way you can experience what poetry's power might be, and what might be the sway of political and ideological powers over poets. In 1840, the population of this island of Ireland was about 8.5 million. Excuse me. That of today's republic, from where I speak today, was then about 6.5 million. By 1850, it was down to about 5 million. By 1961, when I was 11, it was 2.8 million. The so-called Great Hunger, the famine, from 1845 to 1849, saw around 1 million people die here and began the desperate emigration of millions of Irish to countries around the world. The effects of this are still visible in today's Irish landscape, and the political, social and cultural effects on the history of Ireland over the last century have been profound. These are the facts to be apprehended. In what follows, I won't present arguments for the powers of poetry in Irish life. I'll simply try to present some pertinent poems to demonstrate that power. Here is a poem to be felt. It's by one of Ireland's great contemporary poets, Éireann, who died in 2020. It's called Quarantine. In the worst hour of the worst season, of the worst year of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking. They were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back. He walked like that, west and north, until at nightfall, under freezing stars, they arrived. In the morning, they were both found dead, of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847, also what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and a woman, and in which darkness it can best be proved. What are poems if not kinds of sketched understanding suffused with feeling? Personalised examples and instances that show and suggest rather than detached rational arguments that compel and coerce. I do share the view that poetry and philosophy are somehow connected. I like, for example, the Welsh poet Horace Thomas's view of poetry as that which arrives at the intellect by way of the heart. Or, as Robert Frost is reputed to have said, a poem begins in delight and ends in wisdom. And I especially like the American poet Jennifer Grotz's idea that poetry is philosophy's sister, the one that wears makeup. T.S. Eliot in 1947 said that if we learn to read poetry properly, the poet never persuades us to believe anything. And what we learn from Dante or the Bhagavad Gita or any other religious poetry is what it feels like to believe that religion. Here in Ireland, we're coming to the end of what is known here as the Decade of Centenaries, the centenary of 1913 to 1923, commemorating the turbulent and profound events of a century ago, out of which modern Ireland was born. It was from a teeming cauldron of influences in the early 20th century that Ireland emerged to itself become an influence, not least on the vast world of India. Ireland and India were enmeshed in the complexities of an empire from which each struggled to reconstitute itself, and to detach from the British Empire, and in the process to add to the shape of what we both are today. The formative currents included strengthening nationalisms, both cultural and political, advocacies for and against violence, issues of language dominance and identity, impulses towards dominance by one religion of another, ideas of socialism and workers' rights as against the privileges of class, contesting international solidarities, contests for women's rights and inclusion in the body politic, World War I and the collapse of empires, the advance of a scientific understanding of the world and of humans in that world, contesting arguments for the relationship of church and state, and so on. A century on, all of these issues remain live and active. Poets and poetry are, in my view, as deeply embedded in the complexities and ambivalences of their own time as are any kind of artist and any kind of citizen. That is the nature of human life. We would dehumanize poets were we to approach them as otherworldly voices, somehow detached from their time and place. As the American playwright and anthropologist Robert Ardrey observed in 1961, we were born of risen apes, not fallen angels, and the apes were armed killers besides. And so, what shall we wonder at? The miracle of man is not how far he has sunk, but how magnificently he has risen. We are known among the stars by our poems, not our corpses. In the scientific advances of this last century, our understanding has gone from thinking our galaxy was the only one to knowing that there are at least 125,000 million galaxies in the observable universe. We've gone from a creationist position to understanding the genetic and molecular details of evolution. And in my own lifetime, as I ended my secondary education in 1968, I did so with my last teacher, a religious, dismissing the theory of evolution as incredible nonsense. And it was only in 1967 that book censorship began to be eased in Ireland. As the historian Brian Kennedy observed, in 1933, Éigse, newly installed Prime Minister, after his return to power following the Civil War and a decade out of power, he felt that the arts in Ireland were to be encouraged when they observed, quotes, the holiest traditions, but should be censored when they failed to live up to that ideal. Irish poets in and from Ireland over the last century exemplify the complexities and ambivalences of allegiance, which have divided and united the island of Ireland over the last 100 years or so. More than 1 million Indian soldiers served in World War I as part of the British India Army, and more than 74,000 died in that conflict. About 210,000 Irishmen served in the British forces during World War I. Since there was no conscription, about 140,000 of these joined the war as volunteers. Some 35,000 Irish died, a disproportionately high mortality rate. By the end of the Second World War, the Indian Army had become the largest volunteer force in history, rising to 2.5 million men in August 1945. Over 87,000 Indian troops were killed in World War II. During World War II, Ireland was officially neutral and independent from the United Kingdom. However, over 80,000 Irish-born men and women, north and south, joined the British Armed Forces, with between 5,000 and 10,000 killed during the conflict. My point in mentioning this is to note the close parallels between India and Ireland in our respective processes of connection and detachment from the British Empire. In 2008, the poet and writer Gerald Dawe published a novel anthology of Irish war poetry called Earth Voices Whispering, in which he juxtaposed the work of 26 diverse Irish poets. Ambivalence as to where they belonged and for whom they fought is loudly present in this anthology. W.B. Yeats was central here, and I'm just going to quote a little from a poem of his called An Irish Airman for Cece's Death, which captures that motivational complexity. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight I do not hate, those that I guard I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross, my countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss or leave them happier than before. Nor law nor duty bade me fight, nor public man nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. And in his brief on being asked for a war poem, Yeats had this to say: I think it better that in times like these, a poet's mouth be silent, for in truth we have no gift to set the statesman right. Regrettably, that view might still find resonance today. There are all too many instances in the world today where poets and writers find, to their cost, that they have, quotes, no gift to set a statesman right. But nonetheless they try, and then often pay a high price for that trying. Recall Article 19 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. The right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. The suppression of the artistic voice is itself an index of its power. The distinguished American critic Helen Vendler noted, a good poem has some sort of pain or moral urgency behind it that has compelled its writer into expression. But to return to Ireland, in the midst of that dreadful war, World War I, a small, disparate group of Irish men and women staged a rebellion, the Easter Rising in April 1916. This changed the course of Irish history, and it influenced the shape of India's history. Studying in my old University College Dublin, at that time was, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Vara Hagiri Venkata Giri, later to be called to be the fourth president of independent India from 1969 to 1974. Giri was suspected of contact with some of the leaders of the rebellion and was deported in June 1916. The Easter Rising of 1916 resonated with many Indians. Others, like Nehru and Surya Sen, were also deeply interested in what might be learned from Ireland at that time. And of course, W.B. Yeats and Rabindranath Tagore were mutually admiring friends. This is a statue of Tagore, which was unveiled in the centre of Dublin in 2011. Amongst the leaders of the Easter Rising were a disproportionate number of poets, one of whom, incidentally, Thomas MacDonagh, lectured Giri in UCD. Other poet leaders, or leaders who wrote poetry, were Pádraig Pearse, Joseph Plunkett, James Connolly and Roger Casement, just to mention those who were executed in the aftermath of the 1916 Rising. 4 of the 7 signatories of the Proclamation of 1916, all executed, were published poets. As I grew up in the shadowy aftermath of the Civil War that followed from 1922 to 1923, there was a kind of historical omerta. Much came to my generation through the poetry we were taught in schools in the 1950s. This one, The Wayfarer, by Pádraig Pearse, was written in the hours before his execution on the night of May the 3rd, 1916, and to this day is fondly remembered by school friends of mine from the 1950s. The beauty of the world hath made me sad, this beauty that will pass. Sometimes my heart hath shaken with great joy to see a leaping squirrel in a tree, or a red ladybird upon a stalk, or little rabbits in a field at evening lit by a slanting sun, or some green hill where shadows drifted by, some quiet hill where mountainy man had sown and soon would reap, near to the gate of heaven. Or children with bare feet upon the sounds of some ebbed sea, or playing on the streets of little towns in common, things young and happy. And then my heart had told me, these will pass and change, will die and be no more. Things bright and green, things young and happy, and I have gone upon my way sorrowful. Pádraig Pearse was deeply Catholic, but for me the sentiments of this particular poem connect with the insights of Buddhism, for example, with its recognition of the deep connection between transience and suffering. Yet another connection to India. But the poet who most caught the complexities, ambivalences and significance of that period was William Butler Yeats. His great poem, Easter 1916, perhaps the most famous poem in Ireland of this era, caught the complexities, uncertainties, volatilities of judgment, and evolving significance of this failed military rebellion as it morphed into a successful political rebellion in a way that echoes my earlier quotation from T.S. Eliot. Easter 1916 captures what it felt like for many in Ireland as they came to grips with the Rising and its aftermath. Yeats began his composition in the months after the Rising in 1916, but didn't publish it until 1921. It became to Irish ears, in the words of the theatre director Micheál Mac Léonóir and the poet Ivan Boland, as familiar as a nightly prayer. Yeats captures the deep transformations of feeling of an embryonic nation, struggling to master the many turbulent currents, contending to shape the direction and emerging form of Ireland, and he recognises the dangers involved. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. He ends the poem with a simple acknowledgement of how his admiration is fused with ambivalence. I quote, "And what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonagh and MacBride and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn or changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born." That last line, "a terrible beauty is born," is amongst the most famous in poetry. And those currents of ambivalence, so well named in those 5 words of W.B. Yeats, became the concerns of writers and poets in Ireland for the following century. Each season of history shapes the preoccupations of those who must live through it. As the new Ireland moved from preoccupations with war and independence, violence and democracy, from the 1930s through to the 1960s, so the preoccupations of its poets shifted inwards to preoccupations with what the late Evan Boland might have called permissions, or rather the lack of them. What you are allowed to say and what not, and who are the ones permitted to say it and who not. There was something shrunken about the early decades of the newly independent Ireland as it struggled to establish itself as a democracy and to survive economically with an ideal of self-sufficiency and to forge some viable version of the intellectual ideals that surged and contested in the crucible years following 1916. Many hopes seemed dashed in the years that followed, and much bitterness endured following the brief civil war of 1922-23. On this small, now partitioned island, each with a dominating, though opposed sectarian colour, with a brace of allegiances, Protestant Unionist in the north, Catholic Nationalist in the south, it has taken most of a century to see the dynamics of those tensions work their ways out to today's happier and hopefully more peaceful prospects. And poets again emerged to give voice to what those decades felt like for many. The opening of the Civil War in 1922, ironically, caused the obliteration of centuries of documented Irish history, when the ammunition stored in the building housing the archives of the anti-treaty forces blew up, a symbolically resonant image for an emerging nation. But the peaceful transfer of power in 1932 from those who fought for the treaty side in the Civil War to those who violently opposed the treaty and precipitated the Civil War marked the rather rare at that time stabilisation of Ireland as a functioning democracy. Yet what followed were decades of what could only be called stagnation. The practicalities of governing the new state in the aftermath of those years of violence and ambition were daunting. But a deep, conservative, clerically dominated and politically enabled ethos settled on the new state for the following decades. In the arts, censorship silenced the publicly available voices of many of that era's finest writers. Ireland was technically neutral during World War II, which was known here as the emergency, and I grew up in the aftermath of this. The economy further stagnated, emigration continued, and the population steadily declined to its nadir in 1961, with a population in the Republic of Ireland of just over 2.8 million. Nobel Prize winners like Yeats, Shaw and Beckett, for example, largely wrote from abroad, as had James Joyce. Fine poets in Ireland like Patrick Kavanagh, Austin Clarke, Thomas McCreevy, Thomas Kinsella and John Hewitt, and writers like Elizabeth Bowen, Molly Keane, Kate O'Brien and Mary Lavin, to name just a few, chronicled life in Ireland, life all too often faded, disappointed and unfulfilled. But seeds of structural change, good and bad, began to sprout in the 1960s. Women's rights, or the egregious lack of them, and structural inequalities of class lay noticed but largely unspoken and dormant at this time. Anthologies of poetry show how few women poets populated the world of poetry at that time. This was all to change in the decades to follow. Economic policy opened up, educational policy became the explicit focus of state investment. The new technologies of mass entertainment like television opened Ireland up to perspectives from the outside world. Youth culture and rebellion against the conformities and conventions of previous generations captured the imaginations of the young. The Beatles, some with Irish roots, took Dublin by storm, and not long afterwards brought flavours of India to our part of the world. Censorship was greatly dialed down in the 1960s, and Ireland joined the European Economic Community in 1973. The fruits of all this would ripen in the decades to follow. But the 1960s also saw the emergence, initially peaceful, of a civil rights movement in Northern Ireland demanding an end to discrimination of the minority Catholic population by a dominant Protestant Unionist one. The brutal repression of this civil rights movement led quickly to the terrible eruption of violence that lasted nearly 30 years and is known in Ireland as the Troubles. They reached a fragile conclusion in 1998 with the clever construction and massive support north and south of what is known as the Good Friday Agreement, where the principle of democratic consent is paramount and violence as a tool of politics is renounced. A remarkable generation of poets, mostly from Northern Ireland, emerged at this time and have played a huge role in navigating the intricate routes that poetry and politics might take. Seamus Heaney and Derek Mahan, Michael Longley and Paul Muldoon, Ciaran Carson and Gerald Dahl, to name but a few, have all engaged with the fraught politics of their time. Coming from different sides of the sectarian and national divides, their work shows how an allegiance to the poetic can, and indeed must, avoid being uncritically recruited by the partisan political. In a public conversation earlier this year, the Northern Irish poet Michael Longley reflected on this. He's just received one of the major European poetry prizes last week. He suggested that poetry should be regarded less as having use than as having value, as in, for example, bringing solace in extreme times. Speaking of his own time during the Troubles and the issue of poetry taking sides, Longley said earlier this year, and I quote, "When there's shit on both sides of the fence, you sit on the fence." He went on to say, "None of the poets I know of personally took sides because they were leading with two profoundly inadequate concepts. One is an Orange Ulster, that is the north of Ireland, which we can't have. The other, a great Ireland, which we can't have because of all the Protestants and Unionists. So what is the point of taking sides?" For Longley, he says, the poet must maintain elasticity and refuse to tell lies. I think, he says, conservation is the oldest obligation of poetry and art. All of the poems about the Troubles are elegies, and it is because we must never forget about the victims. That preference for the subtleties of compromise and harmony, for truthful memory and elastic imagination, rooted in the uncertainties of personal life, is, it seems to me, a characteristic of modern Irish poetry. A hidden source of fine poetry is, as the late Derek Mann observed, the watchful heart. With such watchfulness can be joyous on many occasions, and, as Seamus Heaney said, will catch the heart off guard and blow it open. A major advance in Irish poetry and power is evident from the 1970s onwards, with a bloom of new voices, women's voices, and a refocusing of attention on the neglected concerns of half the population. In 1990, Mary Robinson's election as President of Ireland marked a watershed for which many in Ireland had long wished. And the poetic silence in the mid-20th century surrounding the oppressive treatment of mostly poor Irish women and their children in penal institutions retrospectively and belatedly found the watchful hearts they deserved. I think of the work of so many Irish women poets, including Yvonne Boland and Elaine Quillan, Mary O'Malley and Paula Meehan, Mary O'Donnell and Moya Cannon, Rona O'Rourke and Martina Evans, Celia Lefrena and Dorothy Malloy, Rita Ann Higgins and Catherine Phil McCarthy, Dula Nidola and Jean O'Brien, Catherine Ann Cullen and Katie Donovan, and presently, adding to this canon, an ever-increasing cohort of fine younger poets, some of them Indian Irish, many of whom are new Irish, bringing to Irish life all the enrichment of the cultures that their families of origin originated in. Poets have played a key role in nurturing tolerance towards difference and the other in contemporary society in Ireland. Contemporary Ireland is demonstrably more liberal, secular and confident in the world community. The days of dominance by one faith community over the whole society are over. Worldviews, religious and secular, must now place themselves respectfully within a generous, pluralistic island. Nearly 14% of the Irish population in 2022 are immigrants. We've survived and learned from the excesses of the Celtic Tiger economic collapse and the challenges of the COVID pandemic. We have reached our own assessment of the wisdom of our neighbours' regressive exit from the European Union. We value being part of the European Union, politically, economically and culturally. We benefit hugely from our young, educated population, and we take pride in our related integration of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters into contemporary Irish society. And we are ever more aware of the rising tsunami that is climate change, incomparably the greatest danger and challenge facing humanity. Our poets join with our scientists and politicians in ringing the bells of warning about this coming catastrophe for the whole of mankind and for all of the creatures on this beautiful planet. Many Irish poets are writing of this, and I think of Greg Delanty's recent poem, Any Way You Look at It, from his recent collection. This is a kind of what I might call a block sonnet of just 3 words, no more time, that inescapably say the same thing no matter what angle you approach it from, no more time. The same recognition can be heard in Sarah Barclay's new collection from just last month, and I quote, "Poor humans, we are trying so hard, but time is contracting. The future keeps getting shorter. I'm sorry about your baby's sold-out dreams. 30 years will drown the keys." And she writes of the ice that sings its long last song, a requiem. Poets embedded in their times are, like other artists, agents for transcending those times. They can be key fabricators of collective memory, of opposition to cruel and unjust politics, and as enablers of endurance, both during those times and thereafter. So to finally answer the question, which is the title of this talk, of where are poets citizens? For me, the answer lies in Seamus Heaney's poem, From the Republic of Conscience, with which I end this talk. Seamus imagined a country, called Conscience, modelled on a visit he paid to the Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland. I took it, he wrote, that Conscience would be a republic, a silent, solitary place where a person would find it hard to avoid self-awareness and self-examination. And this made me think of Orkney. Good poets, then, or better perhaps, the kinds of poets whom I admire most, would be citizens of that Republic of Conscience. Here, as Michael D. Higgins said last week in the concluding seminar for his own commemorative project, is where we should go, where the pain of doing things right takes you. So I'm going to end by reading out from the Republic of Conscience, which Seamus wrote in 1985. When I landed in the Republic of Conscience, it was so noiseless when the engine stopped, I could hear a curlew high above the runway. At immigration, a clerk was an old man who produced a wallet from his homespun coat and showed me a photograph of my grandfather. The woman in customs asked me to declare the words of our traditional cures and charms to heal dumbness and avert the evil eye. No porters, no interpreter, no taxi. You carried your own burden, and very soon your symptoms of creeping privilege disappeared. Fog is a dreaded omen there, but lightning spells universal good, and parents hang swaddled infants in trees during thunderstorms. Salt is their precious mineral, and seashells are held to the ear during births and funerals. The base of all inks and pigments is seawater. Their sacred symbol is a stylized boat, the sail is an ear, the mast a sloping pen, the hull a mouth shape, the keel an open eye. At their inauguration, public leaders must swear to uphold unwritten law and weep to atone for their presumption to hold office, and to affirm their faith that all life sprang from salt in tears which the sky god wept as he dreamt his solitude was endless. I came back from that frugal republic with my 2 arms to one length, the customs woman having insisted my allowance was myself. The old man rose and gazed into my face and said that was official recognition that I was now, a dual citizen. He therefore desired me, when I got home, to consider myself a representative and to speak on their behalf in my own tongue. Their embassies, he said, were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be